Welcome to the third in this series of Lever-Hume lectures in which Professor Dan Burk will be taking us through some of the more exciting moments in the encounter between the patent system and the copyright system and the new technology and the innovation economy. He may or may not be talking about Panasonic patents in the course of this evening's lecture. I don't know. Those of you who've been following this series of lectures will be very familiar with Dan and his background. For those who are new to the series, Dan is one of the leading IP scholars in the world and an IP scholar of uncommon range. Some of you in this room will probably have been greatly illuminated by Dan talking about patents and literature and the nature of text earlier today, which is something of a rare arrow to have in one's quiver for an IP scholar. We're very grateful to Dan for being here with us as a Lever-Hume visiting professor, and very grateful to the Lever-Hume Trust for sponsoring his visit. So with no further ado, I'll leave you with Dan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for being here. As Alain says, the third in this series of lectures on biotechnology and software patenting in the innovation economy. This third lecture, now that we've laid some groundwork and have explored some of what has been happening in a number of jurisdictions with regard to both biotechnology patenting and with regard to software patenting, we can now focus in on some of the more interesting parts, try to integrate some of the things that we've talked about, explore some similarities and some differences, and perhaps reach one or two tentative conclusions, although we'll see how that works out. Probably not all mysteries will be solved, at least in this lecture, but we might get some sense of what things are likely to look like going forward. Since this is the last lecture, it's my last chance to again thank the Faculty of Law here at LSE for hosting this series of lectures, and as you heard, to the Lever-Hume Trust for sponsoring this series of lectures. So we began a week ago by talking about gene patents. We then moved on to talk in the second lecture about software patenting. We've been very comparative. We've talked about things happening in the United States, which in this area, as so many others, is sort of where the trouble started. But then we've also talked about developments in Europe under the European Patent Convention. We've talked a bit about Australia, Canada. We visited the Germans briefly, and some developments here in the UK. And so now we try to sum up and integrate all of that. For those who are just joining us, and even for those who've been here all along, I want to refresh your recollection a bit about some of the major points that we touched on, because they'll be important to the discussion this evening. So we began a week ago talking about gene patents, looking particularly at patentable subject matter. We said there are a number of criteria for getting a patent. The invention is supposed to be inventive, not surprisingly, or as we say in the US, it's supposed to be non-obvious. It's supposed to be novel, it's supposed to be useful. You have to disclose how to make and use it, but here we focused primarily on controversies regarding what can be patented and what can't, the subject matter question. And we said in the first lecture, and then returned to this again in the second lecture, that in the United States, and we looked at several American cases, and also in Canada, we looked at some Canadian cases, the patent statute actually specifies some categories of subject matter. You can patent processes, machines, articles of manufacture, and compositions of matter. And we said that that was important because every time that we think that something doesn't fit into the patent system, some clever attorney is able to draft patent claims to describe the invention as fitting one or more of the other categories. And so this question of how you describe the invention has been a theme through everything we've talked about so far. And we said that we saw some very different approaches even among jurisdictions with the same text in their statute. Canada saying at one point that new technologies that were not in the contemplation of the legislature weren't really welcome as part of these categories without some express indication from the legislature that they should be admitted, whereas the United States has been very expansive, perhaps too expansive, saying anything under the sun made by a human should fit into one or more of these categories. And as I said, that's where some of the trouble started. This ability to describe the invention in different ways to fit into different categories, we said then led to description of biotechnology in terms of the gene sequences that were involved. That worked pretty well in Canada and the United States. Not necessarily so well under the European Patent Convention, and not necessarily so well under the European Biotechnology Directive, because there are some limitations there. And then we said that Australia has completely rejected the U.S. approach as set out in the U.S. Myriad Genetics case. In particular, we wanted to remember that the Myriad Genetics case left us with kind of a quandary, right? The United States Supreme Court said, well, genomic DNA that's drawn out of human cells is not patentable subject matter, whereas cDNA, complementary DNA that's synthesized in the laboratory, that is patentable subject matter. Said that genomic DNA had the same information that you find in nature, so that excluded it from patentability. And they weren't so concerned about the structure. Even if the structure was different, the information was the same. Whereas with cDNA, they said, well, the structure is different. That makes it patentable. It's not what you find in nature. Although we observed that the information is the same, so we're left in kind of a quandary. They seem to say opposite things with regard to the two different kinds of molecules. And that will be important to us this evening. With regard to software patents, we pointed out then that software patenting controversies regarding subject matter have been developing at about the same time as the gene patenting controversies have been developing. And part of the problem here is that software is at some level high and low voltages in a machine, right? Historically, you could set switches, or you could plug circuits together, or you could create punch cards or punch tapes, or even in Babbage's case, you could design toothed wheels, gears, to instantiate software. So although it seems intangible, at some point it is quite material, very much part of a machine. So you'd think it would fit into some of those categories that we talked about, but because it seemed to run afoul of some things that are excluded from patentability, like abstract ideas, like laws of nature, jurisdictions around the world have been reluctant and troubled about patenting software. And we noted in particular that the European Patent Convention, Article 52, which we'll hear more from this evening, specifically lists categories of subject matter that are excluded from patentability, and specifically says that computer programs are excluded as such. What does that mean? Well, you can't patent a computer program as a computer program. Apparently you can patent it as something else, perhaps as a wristwatch or a pizza oven or something like that. And going back to the slide I showed you a moment ago, the United States and Canada and some other jurisdictions take quite a different approach. Instead of telling us what you can't patent, the U.S. statute tells us what you can patent, right, those four categories that I mentioned, and says nothing about anything that's excluded. So although the United States excludes the same kinds of categories as the European Patent Convention does, it does so as part of the common law, right? This is a judicial gloss on the statute developed by the United States Supreme Court. And so you have similar subject matter exclusions in each jurisdiction, but from radically different texts, right? One text telling us what you can patent, the other text telling us what you cannot patent. And then finally, we looked at the most recent development, the most recent case in the United States, the Alice test, Alice versus International, that gives us a two-part test, right, two prongs, for deciding what's patentable and what's not. The Alice test tells us first that you look for one of the prohibited categories, like abstract ideas or like laws of nature, and then you decide if the patented invention involves one of those. If it does, and if it doesn't, then it's okay, it's patentable subject matter. But if it does involve one of those, you then have to look for some sort of an inventive concept, something that is more than just trying to patent the prohibited subject matter. And if you can't find something inventive there, then you're out of luck. And we said that was very, very close to some parallels that we've seen in the European Patent Office that they've developed for trying to deal with software problems. So some convergence seemed to have been happening on each side of the Atlantic. Now, all of those problems that we've talked about in the previous two lectures seem to come together in a particular technology, a particular set of technologies in recent years, which has to do with medical diagnostics. And so we have a number of cases from different places. I'll focus here on some of the more dramatic US cases that bring together all the problems that we've talked about so far. Not surprising, right? If you think about how you might design a medical diagnostic test, perhaps for a genetic disease, you're going to need some biotechnology and knowledge, right? Some inventiveness in biotechnology, and then you're also going to need probably some type of digitization, some sort of implementation through software, right? That would be a sensible way to set things up given current technology. So the two problem children that we've talked about, software and biotech, sort of come together in these cases. And here are three examples that we could think about, give you a good idea of what kinds of problems we see crop up in this area. A case called Metabolite that was taken by the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court has discretion as to which cases it takes. And so it accepted this Metabolite case and then dismissed it as improvidently granted, right? We call it a DIG, D-I-G. So actually that was a mistake. We really shouldn't have taken that case. We don't want to decide it after all. And there was a dissent from the dismissal from the DIG by Justice Breyer, who said, I think this is a mistake. I think we ought to decide this case. Presumably he was one of the ones who voted to take it in the first place. He said, because I think that it sort of embodies all of the kinds of problems that bother us about patentable subject matter. What was the test here? What was the technology? Well, this was a diagnostic test, right? It was a method claim, a patentable method, or a patented method, of diagnosing a particular metabolic problem in patients, and it recited certain steps in the process. The steps were that you take a sample, a blood sample from the patient. You then look for the levels of a certain type of amino acid that would indicate whether you have this disease, whether you have this metabolic disease or not. And then the doctor performs a correlation step, quote unquote, to decide if you are ill or not. Right? So basically the doctor gets the test results and says, oh, you're sick. And your level is high or your level is low. You're not sick. Right? That's the correlation step. And Justice Breyer said, it seems to me that this involves the prohibited category that we've talked about of abstract ideas. That seems pretty abstract. It did not recite a particular apparatus for performing this test. It just told you what the steps were and then wanted to cover all kinds of implementations. So it seemed pretty broad, pretty abstract. He said it seems to involve also laws of nature, right? We've said that laws of nature are not patentable. And this particular test, he said, I think is essentially trying to claim a natural correlation between the level of amino acid in a patient's bloodstream and whether they're sick or not, right? I mean, and that's just something that happens in nature. If you have this amount of this substance in your blood, then you're sick. And also, this correlation step is disturbing because it seems to involve mental steps, right? And we said in the last lecture that we're reluctant to give patents on things that go on in people's heads, right? Mental steps for a variety of reasons, and you know what the doctor is doing in her brain, recognizing the level of amino acid as being the one that indicates the patient is ill, is a mental step. So I think this is problematic, but the court dismissed that one. Instead, they ended up taking another case a couple of years later that I mentioned last time, Mayo versus Prometheus. Pretty similar, right? Again, it's a diagnostic test, recites a series of steps, right? The problem that's was addressed in this patent was that different patients metabolize drugs in different ways, right? You know, you're given a dose of a particular drug, and your liver may break it down faster than someone else's does. So you need to know, you know, have I given the patient too much or too little? Too much of certain kinds of drugs, like the ones at issue in this patent, can be dangerous and toxic, and too little won't cure the patient. So the method here was, again, you draw a blood sample from the patient, you test it for the level of the pharmaceutical you've administered to the patient in the bloodstream. The doctor, again, performs a correlation step and says, you know, oh, it's too high or too low, and you then adjust the next dosage to give the patient the right amount, you know, more or less than you gave the patient last time. And the court, in an opinion, not surprisingly by Justice Breyer, who we were just talking about, said this is not patentable. It's too abstract, right? Again, it doesn't recite an apparatus. It seems to try and claim all ways of performing this particular diagnosis. And it seems to involve mental steps. You know, the doctor's looking at test results and making a judgment again. The lower courts had said, well, we think there's a material transformation here, which is that you know, you give the patient some drugs and they're broken down in the body. And Justice Breyer said, yeah, but again, that's a law of nature. That's just what the human liver does. And so it seems like they're trying to claim something that's abstract, that involves mental steps, and then involves a law of nature, which is, you know, if you are somebody who has a really gung-ho liver, then you have less of this stuff in your bloodstream, and if you have somebody who has a little more laid-back liver, then you don't. Right? That's just how nature works. Also wanted to mention the Eon Pharmaceuticals case, right? A case that again deals with a diagnostic test. There's a whole series of these. This one I wanted to mention because last time we talked about the prohibition on patenting printed matter, right? We don't like patents on things that are symbolic indicia. We tend to say that those things that, you know, things that are written really belong in the copyright system, not in the patent system. So in Eon Pharmaceuticals, the method claims were to a method of administering a drug, a pharmaceutical, to a patient orally with food. Now, this drug was well known in the prior art, so there's nothing new or particularly interesting about that. And patients had also actually been taking the drug with food for a long time, but they'd been taking it with food in order to avoid an upset stomach. And what these researchers found out was that if you took it with food, it was absorbed faster, and it was actually more efficacious. And so what was there here that was new to patent? Well, the claims were drafted to say that you know, you would administer a pharmaceutical to a patient, and you would either instruct the patient orally, or you would write on the bottle that the pharmaceutical came in, take with food. And this didn't get to the Supreme Court, but the lower courts in the U.S. said, the only thing new here is the writing on the bottle, take this with food, or the oral instruction, which we think is equivalent. And again, we're sorry we don't give you patents on inventions that are basically something that is symbolic, indicia, or written text. That's not patentable subject matter. So lots of the things that we've seen coming up in these diagnostic cases. In particular, Mayo versus Prometheus, that I just mentioned, involving the drug metabolism and the administration, became Supreme Court precedent saying, well, you can't really patent this, and that is where the two-part test we talked about last time from Alice International Corp., the software case, really originated. Apparently not the right version of the slides, but in any event. So metabolite, right, and these other cases I talked about seem to talk about laws of nature embedded in these diagnostic tests as not being patentable. Now, we said last time that there's this idea out there, right, that laws of nature are not patentable because they are somehow embedded in the fabric of the universe. They're sort of out there, right? And they are discovered in some sense rather than being invented. Although if you think about it, right, anytime you have a process involved, right, and we said that's a very typical kind of patentable invention, right? Processes are one of our categories that's typically patentable. You're talking about relationships between physical objects, right? That's what a process is, right? It is some type of relationship between physical entities. So not only these diagnostic cases, but most of the software cases that we talked about tend to be couched in terms of laws of nature. Right? Remember we talked about the early U.S. Software cases like Gottschalk versus Benson. The court said, no, that involves mathematics, and mathematics is a law of nature, so it's not patentable, right? But it shouldn't surprise us that in software cases and other cases where there are processes involved, we repeatedly see a problem with the laws of nature prohibition. Now, why are we worried about laws of nature? Well, there have been a lot of jokes and kind of funny items out there, very much like this one, suggesting why we're concerned about patenting laws of nature or things that boil down to being laws of nature. In the cartoon, right, this is Saturday morning breakfast cereal, Isaac Newton comes to the patent office, right? Oh, hi, Mr. Newton. I'm here, he says, to patent infinitesimal calculus for solutions to physics problems. Don't bother reading the claim because you won't understand it. Just accept that it's over your head and grant me control over it. Right? So the clerk in the patent office says, all right, you'll own the rights for 7 years, at which point they will expire. Newton responds, no, I now have a patent on systems changing with respect to time. Therefore, if you expire my patent, you're violating my patent. And the clerk says, I'm just going to go grab the manager. Newton says, if you use momentum to get there, you owe me royalties. Right? The idea here being, that if Newton got a patent on calculus or on laws of motion, or if Einstein got a patent on specific or general relativity, right, then in some sense we would all owe them royalties because we're all following the laws of nature. And there are a number of cartoons and jokes out there about that. The problem with that, as I alluded to, I think in the questions and answers last time, is those actually happen to be at least the United States Supreme Court's favorite examples, right? Newton couldn't patent gravity, couldn't patent laws of motion. Einstein couldn't patent relativity. And it's ironic that those were the examples that they like to use, right? Because we know that Newton was wrong, right? And one of the people who showed that he was wrong was, in fact, Einstein, right? I mean, sort of Newton gave us some laws, take his laws of motion. They work pretty well for everyday kinds of things, like firing cannons, right? Which is really what he was interested in, was ballistics. Once you get to sort of very large cosmic scales, we know that what he said about gravity, what he said about motion, doesn't actually work very well, right? Einstein helped us understand that. And when you get to very small scales, right, what he said doesn't work either. So de Broglie and Heisenberg and some other folks showed us that it breaks down at atomic and subatomic scales when we get quantum mechanics. If Newton was wrong, it's hard to believe that wrong view of how the universe works is sort of out there in the universe. Right? It seems to make much more sense to say that, well, that was one person's description of how the universe works, and it turns out that it actually doesn't work that way, but it was pretty useful for a while, and actually is still useful sometimes. I presume that sooner or later we'll show that Einstein is wrong at some level. It's held up pretty well, but we know that there are some unexplained bits to it, which is why we don't have anything that really connects relativity with quantum mechanics or good generalized field theorem, right? What Hawking calls the theory of everything. We don't have that. So so this seems like a human description of things, and the history of science is sort of littered with these kinds of models that were useful for a while, and we've now discarded them because we don't think that they were right. So I've given you a few examples on the screen. Kepler, right? Very useful. Helped us figure out the orbits of the planets. But he spent most of his life trying to fit them into regular geometric solids and somehow correlate them to musical tones. He was sure that this should all fit together. It never really did. Euclidean geometry, we know that actually, we live on a sphere, right? So Euclidean geometry doesn't actually work on the surface of the Earth, and it certainly doesn't work out in the universe. But it was pretty good approximation. We still use a fair bit of it. Niels Bohr's design of the atom, right? Like little planets circling the sun. That's quite a catchy sort of model. We still see it show up sometimes, drawn like that. But we know that that's wrong. And in fact, even at the time that he came up with it, we knew that the electrons would have collapsed into the middle, and the whole universe would have fallen apart. Right? So none of those were right. And so it's very hard to believe that these laws or representations of nature are discovered, right? They're pretty clearly human developed. So why would we have a problem with treating the way we treat other human inventions? That's a fundamental question when you get to the laws of nature exclusion. Aren't we just talking about another human invention, maybe a very generalized or very useful one? This is the text that we talked about the last two sessions with regard to the European Patent Convention. And that exclusion for discoveries, scientific theories, and mathematical methods is in there. Let me point out a couple of things that aren't in there, right? So we said in the myriad genetics case that the United States Supreme Court was uncomfortable allowing patents on genes because they were products of nature. That they were materials found in nature. That was the first time that a court in the United States had specifically held, the Supreme Court had specifically held, that products of nature as opposed to laws of nature were unpatentable. And you notice that Article 52, categories that you can see in front of you, don't include anything explicit about products of nature. Right? Maybe that's discoveries, right? But products and theories and methods are not the same thing. Notice also, right, as I said before, that this is couched in the negative, right? It doesn't tell you what is patentable. It tells you what's not patentable. And we said that when the Court of Justice of the European Union looked at some gene sequences, right, in the Monsanto versus Ceftra case, They said, well, if you don't tell us what the function is for a particular gene, if it's not where it performs its function, then it's mere technical information. Now, in the AMP versus Myriad case, right, sort of working it up through the United States Supreme Court, the trial court says something very similar. Right? If the Myriad gene sequences were not patentable, why was that? And the trial court said, well, I think it's because the information in them is the same as the information that you find in a human cell. And we said the Supreme Court picked that up, at least with regard to genomic DNA. Right? Justice Thomas said, oh, genomic DNA may have a different structure than what you find in nature. It may have been changed by a human structurally, but we don't really care about that. What we care about is that the information is the same. And so you can't patent it because the information is what's out there in nature. Now notice, right, that in order to justify this products of nature exception, or in the EU, a very particular kind of exclusion for gene where it's not performing its function, the recourse is to talking about the informational content of the molecule, which is an interesting parallel. We touched on it briefly a week ago. Some people have suggested, well, DNA is an informational molecule because it carries genetic information as this series of base pairs, right? ATCG, and very much like software, carries information as binary code, as we talked about last time. So these kinds of informational artifacts, informational items, should not be patentable on the basis of the information that they carry. Now we need to be a little bit careful with that because remember, these are textual representations of something that we believe exists as a material instantiation, either in a cell, in the Monsanto case, in a plant. We talked about the Harvard College case in a mouse, or in a computer processor or storage medium. Right? So there aren't actually ATCs and Gs in your cells. Right? Those represent certain physical configurations of molecules, just as there are no zeros and ones in the computers that I see scattered around the room here. Right? Those represent bits of information that are either high or low voltages, or certain types of magnetic flux on a disk, or some other sort of physical quantity. Right? So the punch cards that we talked about last time in the software discussion, right, the holes or not holes in the punch card could be represented as ones and zeros, but in fact we said they are a physical quantity. The molecule, right, that was not patentable in the Myriad case is a physical quantity, and that could be instantiated lots of different ways, including I've sort of brought back here the picture of Babbage's difference engine. Right, we said that he did it as gears. That's pretty clearly a machine, right, physical instantiation, but it carries information. So we have to be careful about this characterization of things as informational. Yes, it's true these things are informational, but so is everything else around you, right? All molecules carry information. DNA just carries a lot of it, right, because it's a very large molecule. All kinds of objects may carry information. We use that in order to design digital processors, right, to do various kinds of tasks. Could be something that's obviously a machine, like Babbage's toothed wheels, or it could be something that's still probably pretty obviously a machine, like punch cards, or it could disappear, sort of into the background the way that the high and low voltages do in your semiconductor chip. You can't really see those, but they're physical quantities nonetheless. The AMP versus Myriad case, we talked mostly about the genetic sequences themselves, right, that were characterized by the Supreme Court as informational. We sort of didn't talk about the fact that there were also process claims, that the Myriad case was itself one of these diagnostic cases. The lower courts decided on the basis of Mayo versus Prometheus that I mentioned a moment ago that those claims were invalid. Everybody pretty much agreed that they were invalid because they somehow were taking advantage of a law of nature, right? Just like the metabolite case that I talked about, just like Mayo versus Prometheus. The lower court said, well, if the correlation of dosage and illness in metabolite is a law of nature, then the correlation between having certain gene sequences in your cells and being susceptible to breast cancer, that's also a natural correlation. Right? That's also a law of nature. And so under the Mayo test, we don't think that the process claims in the Myriad case can possibly be patentable. So that didn't even make it as far as the Supreme Court, right? Mayo versus Prometheus pretty much cut that off. If that's the case, right, then it's very difficult to see how any diagnostic method can be patentable, right? They all involve, taking some sort of medical sample. Maybe it's images that are scanned from a patient, maybe it's tissue from a patient, maybe it's some other sort of information-bearing artifact that is gleaned from the patient, and then analyze it and decide if the patient is well or ill, or if the patient can be susceptible to this treatment or that treatment. And all of those, under the same logic, seem to be laws of nature, right? There's a correlation between this outcome of the test and the state of the patient. So I'm actually told by people in the medical diagnostic field, they said, we're not actually that worried about the Supreme Court decision in Myriad saying that gene sequences are not patentable. As we talked about in questions and answer a week ago, that's kind of old technology anyway. They said, but Mayo versus Prometheus and this laws of nature business, that's a killer, right? Because that seems to say that any kind of test that we develop that is based on a natural correlation is going to be unpatentable, right? And all medical tests are based on natural correlations. We're looking for some signal or indicator from a patient that would tell us that they are ill. That's what diagnosis is about, and that seems to be what the Supreme Court said is pretty well unpatentable. And I am missing a number of slides, so let me sort of extemporize for a few minutes. So I've suggested to you, right, that laws of nature rationale doesn't seem to work too well. I've suggested to you that the laws of nature exclusion is problematic. And if you think about it for a minute or two, you realize that the other exclusions that we've talked about over the last two lectures sort of travel as a pack, right? So I've mentioned tonight and in the previous lectures not only the laws of nature exclusion, but the abstract ideas exclusion. Right? We don't like to patent things that seem to be very abstract. When you read a case like Mayo versus Prometheus, or some of the other diagnostic cases that I mentioned to you, you realize that it's not clear what the particular exclusion is that the court is relying on. Right? Is the diagnostic method in Mayo unpatentable because it is an abstract idea? It's not concrete enough? Or is it unpatentable because it is a law of nature? And at different times, the court seems to be saying both things. Or is it unpatentable, as I suggested to you a moment ago, because it involves mental steps? Right? If you sort of think about the logic there, you realize, well, if I have something that involves the law of nature, that might be kind of abstract, right? Laws of nature, like the laws of motion or general relativity, those are big ideas. They're laws of nature, and they're also pretty abstract ideas. From there, it's only a short step to being somehow involved in mental steps, right? If I have an abstract idea, it's probably taking place in somebody's head at some point, so I may have a mental steps problem. So these things all seem to sort of travel together, and they all seem to be overlapping. And it seems that when they are invoked, that the European Patent Office or the United States Supreme Court is trying to get at something, but it's not always clear what it's trying to get at, right? Because you have different rationales. Could be mental steps, could be an abstract idea, could be a law of nature. But virtually all of these cases, with the exception of Myriad, as I indicated a moment ago, involve processes. Right? So all of the software cases we talked about last time involve processes of computing or processing information. Right? The diagnostic cases that I just talked to you about all involve processes, methods of extracting information. Most of the other subject matter cases that have been problematic around the world involve processes. Right? The sole exception is the Myriad Genetics case, which, as I said, was really the first case, at least in the United States, to flat out state that a product or material item was unpatentable. And as I've indicated to you and what I just showed you, the courts seem to have done that by somehow trying to turn a physical instantiation, right, a chemical, a structural molecule, into something that looks like a process or involves a process, right, something informational. Because what, after all, is a process? It's typically a transfer of information. And you can think about this in several different ways. We know from our friend Stephen Hawking up at Cambridge and from others who've worked on in this area that more and more we think of the universe as made up of three things: matter, energy, and information. In fact, the first two might be the same thing, right? Einstein kind of suggests that to us. So maybe it's just two things, right? There's stuff and there's information that orders the stuff, puts it in some kind of form. Shannon Weaver and others have developed ways to quantify, right? Sort of the amount of information that you can get in DNA or in software or in a particular communication signal. So we can really think about processes as being the transfer of information. And that seems to be the problem that the patent system is grappling with, both when we talk about biotechnology and when we talk about software, right? That the information is very close to the surface. It's fairly easy with 19th century technology, early 20th century technology, things that look like Babbage's gears, because those are, to the naked eye, pretty obviously a physical instantiation, a machine. We know that it contains information, but that doesn't bother us too much because we can focus on the materiality of it. Becomes harder when we start to talk about computer processing, becomes harder when we start to talk about biotechnology. And so these exclusions that we've developed for trying to keep things like mental steps, things like abstract ideas, things like laws of nature out of the patent system don't work as well with those technologies. Now, if that's not working well, given what we've said over the course of the three lectures, what would work better, or at least what goal do we have in mind that we're trying to accomplish by invoking these doctrines like laws of nature and so on? I think it's fairly clear from the U.S. Supreme Court cases, a little less clear in the European Patent Office that we've talked about. the European Patent Office, as we said last time, doesn't really belong to any particular country, and so it's not as clear that there's concern about public policy. They're really being very, very formalist in a lot of the cases, very textualist, trying to figure out what the European Patent Convention tells them they have to do. So the policy, if it exists, is probably in the European Patent Convention. But the United States Supreme Court, being the Supreme Court of a particular country, and some of the other Supreme Courts that we talked about, the Canadian Supreme Court, Australian Supreme Court, they're actually sort of very, very open about their public policy goals. And what the United States Supreme Court has said in the most recent cases that we've talked about in this series, the Alice case, the Mayo case, the Myriad case, is that they are worried about what they call preemption. Now, what do they mean by preemption? They are worried, very much like the cartoon I showed you of Newton, that we're going to patent something that is so fundamental and so necessary to innovation that it's going to cut off a lot of innovation downstream, right? There's going to be a fundamental principle, a fundamental invention that will prevent other people from inventing. What Justice Stevens once called the building blocks. Right, that this is a sort of a necessary input, a building block that everyone needs in order to do more inventing, and we don't want to prevent them from getting a hold of that. We don't want to prevent them from getting access to that, and that's what we're trying to do with this subject matter exclusion. Now, that's extraordinarily difficult to do for the reasons I showed you, for example, with regard to laws of nature, right? Since everyone, in some sense, uses momentum, right, as Newton says in the cartoon, to do other things. It's not clear that Newton's formulation, right, is something that's not a human invention. So how do you figure out which human formulations are fundamental and which ones aren't, right? Because if it would be a bad outcome for everyone to have to pay Newton royalties for using momentum, we don't want that to happen. But we also want to encourage creative people to come up with formulations like that one. And see, an even bigger problem when you get to products of nature, right, to the myriad genetics type of situation. We're talking about processes that transfer information, sort of fundamental laws of nature, what we think are fundamental descriptions of nature that we use, at least at this point in history. You might be able to figure out what those are, but materials, what kinds of materials are so fundamental that we don't want to grant a patent on them? Does that include genes that have been extracted from cells? If you think about what the Supreme Court said in the Myriad case, that the genomic DNA is unpatentable, but the cDNA is patentable. And in the Mayo and Alice cases, the Supreme Court said there's a two-part test to determining that. Although they don't say this in the Myriad case, you have to conclude that genomic DNA fails the two-part test in Alice, whereas cDNA, complementary DNA, passes the two-part test. Now, in neither case was the technology inventive, right? It was sort of very routine, off-the-shelf technology. That suggests that if you apply the Alice case, they didn't get to the second prong, right? That these materials were judged to be fundamental or not fundamental based on the first prong, right? Asking about excluded categories. So how would you conclude that genomic DNA, which they said was not patentable, is something from nature, is part of an excluded category, whereas the cDNA somehow isn't? And what they seem to be doing is trying to get at one being fundamental, a building block, the other one not being. So that's quite difficult to judge, but at least we can have a discussion about that, right? We have a particular purpose in mind, right, that we want to try and keep certain things free, certain things available to future inventors, other things we're willing to give patents on. and couching it in those particular terms seems to make more sense than talking about them in terms of the excluded categories, either that, as I said, are judicial glosses on the American statute, or in the case of the European Patent Convention, that are listed in Article 52, right? How do you know whether something is a discovery or a scientific theorem as such, right? How do you know whether something is a mental step or an abstract idea? Those categories are problematic, but talking about whether something is a building block, whether something is necessary to downstream innovation, that may make more sense. And so what we're going to see, I think, going forward is probably some of the same rhetoric, right? Because all of these decisions are couched in particular terminology. It's either dictated in the European Patent Office by Article 52, or it's dictated in the United States by terminology that the Supreme Court has used of laws of nature or products of nature. But the fundamental underlying question is, when we've got information technologies, what is so basic, what is so necessary to downstream innovation that we want to keep it as free as possible. And the tropes of laws of nature and mental steps and so on might not get us there, but having a policy discussion about whether something is a building block that's necessary, that might. Okay. And so with that, I think our time for presentation is up, but there's time for questions. Do you want me to field questions, or do you want to?
I think we've evolved the convention over the course of these lectures that rather like the Supreme Court, Dan will decide which questions he wants to take and in what order. So
okay. So the last bit didn't have any slides with it, but hopefully it made some sense. Yes, ma'am. Oh yes. Remember the microphones are very important for the recording.
Well, I have a question which is also a comment. I agree with you that the court arguments sometimes are inconsistent in all these cases. But some of these inconsistencies can a little bit be explained. If you look at the history of patentable subject matter in the US, well, in section 101, which defines patentable subject matter, it is stated that whoever invents or discovers, so no distinction between discovery and invention is made within the article. The true distinction, well, came about with the Chakrabarty case. Since the Supreme Court had opened up to biotech products patenting, they had to say something like, okay, this microorganism invented by Chakrabarty, okay, is patentable, although it is alive. So we are opening up, but this doesn't mean that everything is patentable. So the expression, anything under the sun which is made by man, which is connected to the Chakrabarty case. It's never recalled, but it's a kind of comment made by Judge Rich, who has been a very powerful judge within the Court of Customs and Patent Appeals. So when the Supreme Court opened up to biotech products patenting, they had to make a statement in so many ways. They had to say, okay, we're opening up, but this doesn't mean that Newton's law or Einstein's law or abstract idea are patentable. So we set at the same time some limits. So, I would like also to add that the product of nature doctrine at the time when Chakrabarty was decided was considered not very much alive, although it's a very old IP doctrine in the US. But most scholars think that with Chakrabarty, it has a kind of new life, and that's why in the Myriad case, the Supreme Court referred to the idea of a product of nature. So it makes sense within that system to recall the idea of product of nature if you look at the whole history of how this category evolved.
So I think that's right, that it's important to look at the whole history, and I apologize to those who are perhaps not fascinated by the U.S. patent system. Chakrabarty is an interesting place to start, right? Because Chakrabarty had nothing to do with products of nature, right? The question in Chakrabarty that was posed to the court, and which the court answered, is, as you mentioned, living subject matter part of the patent, the categories we talked about, part of Section 101, patentable subject matter. And on the way to deciding that question, the court throws off a couple of paragraphs, which we would call dicta, right, that are not holding, that are not binding under stare decisis, saying essentially as a foil to their decision, yeah, this is not the right, the question here is whether living subject matter is patentable, not whether products of nature and laws of nature and so on are patentable, because everybody agrees that Chakrabarty has altered this bacterium, right? So it's clearly not a product of nature. It clearly has nothing to do with any of the other excluded categories. So we can ignore all of that and move on to the question about living subject matter. Right? As a consequence, Myriad is, as far as I can tell, the first U.S. case, certainly U.S. Supreme Court case, that actually addresses squarely the question of products of nature. Now, there are some very old cases dealing with, for example, the American fruit growers case, dealt with a method of impregnating the rinds of citrus fruit with borax. Right? So if you had an orange or a grapefruit, you would coat it with borax to prevent mold spoilage. And the question was posed, is this patentable subject matter? Is it a manufacture in particular under the statute in the early 20th century? And the court said, well, no. There's nothing patentable here. It's sort of a product of nature. The borax is just doing what borax does. The fruit is still a fruit. And so it's not the product of human handiwork. Now, first of all, I think that's pretty questionable just on its face, right? I mean, you cannot go out, as far as I know, anywhere and pick citrus fruit, oranges that have borax on them off the tree. So it's pretty obviously been altered by humans. But the key point here is that this was pre-1952. Right? So what they were really asking was, does this take an inventive step? Right? The question wasn't, is this patentable subject matter? The question was, is this inventive? And there are a number of pre-1952 cases that ask that question, and it's always a question about, is it inventive? What, after 1952, the U.S. statute would call Section 103, right? Is it obvious or not? The court mentions all those old cases, right, but none of them are actually relevant or on point because they're all prior to the current statute. They all talk about what we would now call a 103 question, an obviousness or inventive step question. And if they were posed, post-1952, that would be the way that they would be couched. All the other cases, and there are lots and lots of them, right, mostly software cases that we talked about last time, talk about laws of nature, not products of nature. So when Justice Thomas in Myriad gets to the question, is the gDNA, is the genomic DNA patentable subject matter, he cites all of these software cases, right? Lots and lots of cases dealing with laws of nature as precedent for the idea that a product of nature, right, a tangible item, is outside the patent system. And the way that he gets there is by trying to characterize the DNA molecule as a kind of law of nature. Right? It is a material instantiation of information that is out in the universe. Because it's a material embodiment of a law of nature, right, very much like Mayo versus Prometheus correlation, that, he says, makes it unpatentable. So it's really a new creature, right, this idea of product of nature. And it's not clear that you see it elsewhere, like in Article 52 either, right? I mean, maybe you would call it a discovery, but certainly there's nothing sort of extent in Article 52 that says products of nature are not patentable. And as we talked about 2 sessions ago, elsewhere, both the EU Biotechnology Directive and the implementing rules in the EPO actually are very explicit that things like genes, even though they occur in nature, are in fact patentable, rejecting the American case. So I think you're right that Chakrabarty is the place to look to start, but it actually doesn't help very much with the conclusion that you reach when you get to the Myriad case. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Just a small addition to this one.
Yeah.
When you engineer a virus to do a specific function, a virus is not a living organism.
He wants to get you on tape. Okay, so viruses.
Viruses can be engineered to perform a specific function, like the introduction of a protein in medical, but it's not a living organism. How does this fit into the system?
Well, I guess the way it fits into the system is you don't have to worry about what we just said was the Chakrabarty question, right? Which was, is a living organism patentable or not? Now, let me drop a footnote there and say, I'm not sure that the Supreme Court would make a big distinction, right, between a bacterium and a virus, right? I don't think that they're that sophisticated. And I was saying, well, close enough, right? I mean, it may be an obligate parasite, but but it behaves in some way, so they might treat it the same way. But if they're being, sort of technically correct in the spirit of your question, then you don't have to worry about the Chakrabarty question, whether it's living or not. Instead, you move to the Myriad question, right? Nobody argued that the gene sequence was living. Right? It's a chemical molecule, right? Sort of in isolation. In fact, the claims are very explicit that it was in isolation. And so now the question is this substance, this non-living substance, chemical moiety or chemical entity, is that patentable subject matter? And depending on what you've done to the virus, right? You may or may not pass muster under the 2-part Alice test, right? Certainly, if you have discovered a new virus, and I use the term discovered advisedly, as for example happened in the case of HIV, right? A number of patents were taken out once the HIV virus was isolated, both in the United States. You may remember there was sort of a fight between the French researchers and the US researchers on that, because the pre-Myriad case law seemed to say that that was a patentable thing that you had extracted from nature. My guess at this point would be that Myriad says you can't patent that. So you would have to somehow alter it and convince someone who challenged it, convince the patent office that you have managed to pass the first prong of the Alice test, right? That it's been changed by humans enough that you don't have to worry about it being part of a prohibited category. So it's a Myriad case question, not a Chakrabarty case question. Other questions? Well, we've got a couple. Start here and then we'll go over here. Yeah.
I was interested in what you mentioned about gDNA being not patentable, but cDNA is, even though it's in the United States, even though it's it conveys the same information, just synthetic. It's the only twist. For your example with the borax in the orange, if they had injected something that was acted the same way as borax, kind of analogous to the cDNA to the gDNA, does the exact same thing, but is a synthetic version, and that's the only difference, would that mean that they would get away with it?
Yeah. So again, the borax, the American fruit growers case, being a pre-1952 case under the old statute, was really about inventive step. There's another case that may be closer to your hypothetical that Justice Thomas talks about in Myriad, dealing with an inoculum of microorganisms that farmers would use to help plants fix nitrogen. Right? So some plants, like wheat, are bad at fixing nitrogen, and you can essentially infect their root nodules with bacteria that help them to fix nitrogen. And there were 4 different species of microorganism that would do this, and the patent in that particular case combined the 4 species in one package. Different species would infect different plants and help different plants to fix nitrogen. But the farmer used to have to go out and buy, different inocula for different plants. And it was actually thought that if you combined them, that they would inhibit each other. This inventor, I use the term advisedly, put them all together in one package and sold them in one package. The Supreme Court got the case and said, no, we're sorry, that's not patentable. And it's pretty clear, right, because again, this is a pre-1952, pre-US statute, section 103 obviousness case, that what they're saying is this is not inventive, right? This is obvious. Justice Stevens comes very close to saying, this is just packaging, right? This is a new kind of marketing, and putting things in the same package or marketing is not inventive enough to qualify for a patent. Or as we would now say, it's obvious. One of ordinary skill in the art could put these things together. Now clearly it's new, right? Nobody had put these 4 things together before. Just like the citrus fruit with the borax has to be new, right? It has to have been changed in some way by a human because citrus fruit doesn't normally have borax in its rind. But it may very well be that if that kind of a case or your hypothetical was sort of brought into the current statute, that we would in fact conclude, this is a trivial advance over the prior art. It's obvious, so it doesn't take what 103 calls. It's obvious, or doesn't take an inventive step, as we would say here. Not so much the question, which we're now very concerned about, Section 101. Is it patentable subject matter? Does it fall into one of the prohibited categories? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, over here. Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic. There we go.
So, do you think there should be a reformulation of the law to refresh the wording of all of it, basically, to defend the concepts that they want to defend? Because it sounds like that they have this idea, and the current law doesn't fit the stuff that's coming through, and they're just adding stuff on top in layers that's getting messier and messier.
Yeah. So that's law, right? That's kind of how law works. It would be nice if they were transparent about what they were trying to do, right? And it might even be nice if this were codified in some way. And it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about the United States Supreme Court looking at Section 101, and I think I mentioned this maybe 2 sessions ago, and it actually goes to the earlier question. Judge Rich, who the questioner mentioned, said Section 101 was easy, right? I mean, you just read the text. Is it an article of manufacture? Is it a machine? Is it a process or a composition of matter? If it's one of the things, you're done. Right. The categories of excluded subject matter, like mental steps, products of nature, laws of nature, right? They aren't in the text. Right? That's all judicial gloss. That's all common law development on top of the text. Judge Rich's view was, we don't need that. Just throw that out. Right? If it was needed, it would be there in the text. Why was it developed? Well, for the reason you're suggesting, right? For the reason that we're talking about, that they're trying to accomplish something else. So, so it might be nice, maybe for the legislature to step in and say, you're entitled to a patent if it's within one of these categories. If it's something under the sun made by a human, and it's not too fundamental, right? Absent that, given that we have a doctrine developed by common law, It might be nice if the Supreme Court were to say, they have said they're worried about preemption, right? And maybe they should just say, as long as we're making doctrine up, right, things that aren't in the statute, forget the categories of mental steps and laws of nature. We're just worried about things being too fundamental. But you have the same problem in a more sort of administrative civil law situation, right, like Article 52 of the EPC. So that lists, as we said last week, a bunch of excluded categories. It doesn't really tell you why they're excluded. It just says you can't get a patent on these things. And the European Patent Office, for the last 30 years has tried to find some commonality there. The commonality, as we said, being, well, is it technical or not? Well, okay, that's not really terribly helpful either. They are probably trying to get at something similar. I mean, I think they're actually just more worried about administering the treaty, right? But if you need some commonality there, why are we trying to look at these categories, or what does it mean to be a computer program as such? It might be nice if the treaty said, or if the implementing rules said, oh, well, what we're really talking about is something that's a really fundamental building block, if that's what they're trying to get at. It's not clear that it is. It's very clear that's what the Supreme Court is trying to get at. So yes, transparency is always nice, but the reality is, who's going to come back and amend the treaty to do that, right? Or in the case of the U.S. statute, Congress is much busy doing things like trying to screw up the negotiations with the Iranians and, worrying about, how they're going to win the next election, to come back and keep revising the patent statute to be more transparent. I probably shouldn't admit this on film, but, a number of my colleagues just sent a letter to Congress saying, there's still a lot of problems with the patent system, and there's a lot of empirical data showing that there are problems with the patent system, and so patent reform is not done. There's lots of reform that could be done. I didn't sign that, right? Because although it's true, there is lots of data showing the patent system is screwed up, and there's lots of reform to be done. I do not want to encourage the legislature to mess around with anything, right? They did plenty last time. We still don't know what the outcome of that's going to be. So they don't come back and do it very often. You wouldn't want them to come back and do it very often. And actually, it makes a fair amount of sense for a court or an administrative agency to do the heavy lifting here and figure out, how the details should work out. Mostly, what I'm suggesting here is, I think, as you may be suggesting, transparency would be nice. So if that's what you want to do, just say that's what you want to do, and you don't need to dress it up in a lot of interesting legal doctrines. You say, this is the fundamentals that we're trying to get at. Let's do it that way. Anybody else? It's Friday night. We should all be out on a date or something. Yeah. Well, one more.
So I think this may have partly already been answered, but just in the case of, because you do see that software gets patents still somehow, and parts of it are somehow they get patents. So what would your take be on, say, code that was generated through, like, say, one of the upcoming evolution processes, or code that was written by an AI, and so like it's already a synthetic creation that went through a process or something like that, and I don't know. It seems like that could be another real, because like
So I just read a really bad article on this. I won't mention any names. There are people thinking about this in really unsophisticated ways already. I'm actually not terribly worried about that because we're so far from anything resembling actual AI that I don't think it's going to be a real problem anytime in the near future. I mean, we have things. The example in the article was that there are algorithms that can be used in identifying promising pharmaceutical products. And the algorithms are actually written in such a way that they will alter their own programming. it'll change the program in the course of looking for a pharmaceutical candidate. As it sort of learns, what's, I use the term learns advisedly, but as it gathers data on what's a good target, not a good target, it will change its own programming to look for the things that are good targets. And so the article sort of posed the question, a target was identified by means of this program, which seems, sort of HAL-like in some way, in that it, changes its own programming as it goes along. So is it an inventor? You can answer that several ways, right? So first of all, we know, for example, under U.S. copyright law, that's not true under all countries' copyright law, but in the U.S., we explicitly know that something that is generated by a computer program, right? And there are lots of things that might be called art or might be called, copyrightable subject matter. The computer program cannot be an author. Right? The author of the computer program is considered to be the author of any output from the computer program. Now, maybe someday, way down the road when the computer program actually starts to complain about that, we'll rethink that, right? But at least for copyright purposes, we know that copyrightable subject matter generated by a computer program is considered to be the output of whoever designed the tool, whoever designed the computer program. That makes a fair amount of sense for patentable inventions, right? So the discovery of a new pharmaceutical product by a program that was designed by probably some combination of computer scientists and pharmaceutical scientists. Probably they're using a tool just like you would use any other tool, whether it's a Cepheidex column or a centrifuge or something to find things. And then just sort of the formal definitions of how invention works, right? Again, sort of reverting to U.S. law, which I'm most familiar with, but most jurisdictions are similar. In order to be an inventor, right, you have to have a conception, right? Conception is the formulation in the mind of the inventor of the invention as it will exist in its, some sort of definite and concrete form. I don't think the AI has a mind to conceive of an invention so that it would work as being an inventor under the statute. Again, sometime in the future when an AI wants to disabuse me of that notion, we can have that conversation, but I don't think we're there yet. So at this point, pretty much anything that we have is probably a tool that's being used by a human being. And there are all kinds of interesting versions of this going around. One of the examples I like to give my students is there's some elephant that paints pictures, right? Can the elephant be an author? Or I guess if the elephant put Legos or something together, could it be an inventor? Under current law, the answer is pretty clearly no, right? Non-humans don't count. And I can hold forth on this at some further length, but I don't think we're there, and even if we were there, I don't think that the statute would accommodate a non-human inventor. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Anybody else want to hear about aliens or non-human inventors? Elephants. All right. An intervention by the moderator.
I guess since we do have a few minutes left, just an invitation to speculation, whether you might want to say anything about the sort of ultra-contemporary products of nature case, which is the Roslin case, the case of Federal Circuit this year. The people who invented, if that's the right word, Dolly the sheep. This time it's not a claim to the process.
Oh, did that even go anywhere?
Claim to the product.
Yeah. So there are a number of these. I thought that sort of was DOA, but okay. So there actually, there are a number of these, right? Most of them are stem cell cases, right? And again, this goes back a little bit to the virus question. Our virus questioner has stepped out for a moment. It doesn't really matter whether it's living subject matter or not, right? After Chakrabarty, we don't care. The only thing we really care about is the Alice test now. So question number one is, is it a prohibited category of subject matter? Dolly or a stem cell or whatever is, probably not an abstract idea, probably not a mental step. Does it qualify as a product of nature? Well, if Chakrabarty's bacterium isn't a product of nature, I don't know why Dolly would be. Right? Something that most people don't know about Chakrabarty's bacterium is he didn't actually use recombinant DNA technology to create the bacterium. He used bacterial conjugation, right, which is sort of bacteria sex. They exchange genes under certain circumstances, which is a completely natural process. The birds and the bees and the Pseudomonas bacteria. So it's not clear to me why why Dolly would be. Stem cells are a little bit harder. It kind of depends on the claims in the stem cell cases, and we have one sort of very bad trial court case on this at this point. If your claim is just to sort of have isolated the stem cells, then that does look a fair amount like Myriad, right? But if you've done anything more to that to create a cell line, which is common in most cell lines, right? If you do something to transform the cells so that they grow in a laboratory environment, then my guess is that you probably aren't in a patentable prohibited category. So you probably can get past the first prong of Alice. And then if you assume that Dolly or the stem cell is in a prohibited category, now you get to prong 2, right? Is there something inventive? Again, I would think it wouldn't be that hard to make that argument, right? That you've done something that's more than just trying to claim the subject matter. It'll depend a little bit on the stem cell or whatever. So that's kind of why I thought that was DOA, and I kind of thought it had gone away already. But if it hasn't, I would hope it would go away pretty quickly. Any other sheep, bacteria, mice, computer programs?
Well, in that case, I just wanted to say thank you very much for a course of 3 wonderfully stimulating lectures. Thank you very much.